welcome back to YCR's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are just seeing YCR for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals. We believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please feel free to connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All of them are at YC Resources if you want to learn more about what we do. Today, joining us, we have Pat Kehoe. Pat is the Chief Conservation Officer for Ducks Unlimited Canada. He joins us with over 35 years of experience in waterfowl and wetlands management. Pat comes with a wide range of experience, including a master's in zoology and a bachelor's of science in ecology and evolution from the University of Western Ontario. I don't want to step on our toes too much here, and I would love to let Pat speak for himself. But just before I hand the floor over, please note that attendees are encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box below, and we'll address all of these at the end of the session. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having your time and expertise here.
All right, well, thanks for inviting me. World Wetland Day, so it's a day to celebrate wetlands and gain a better understanding of the role wetlands play in providing environmental goods and services or ecological goods and services society, and how important wetland conservation is in the realm of sustainable development. And I really believe there's ways that industry and conservation can work together to conserve wetlands and advance sustainable development goals. I'll talk a little bit about Ducks Unlimited, the organization I work for, and then I'll go into a little bit about the Canadian Wetland Roundtable, a group that I started about, 2014 to provide some leadership and open dialogue at the national level on various aspects of wetland conservation. So that's sort of the plan, and happy to answer questions. I'll try and keep it short and hopefully engaging, and we can have a discussion at the end.
Sounds fantastic.
Let's see.
Please feel free to share your screen whenever you are ready as well.
Yeah, let's just make sure I'm there. Okay, does that work?
Looks perfect.
Yep.
Okay,
we got it.
First part's Ducks Unlimited. Ducks Unlimited is a conservation organization focused on wetland conservation, of course. And I just got to figure out how to advance the slides because it's slightly different. There we go. So we're celebrating our 85th year of conservation excellence. We started in 1938, Ducks Unlimited Canada. We've been partnering with landowners, governments, and Indigenous people, institutions, and industries right across the country to create a landscape level impact that advances sustainability and climate resiliency. We were founded by a group of American hunters that were concerned about a drought that was occurring across the prairie landscape, and waterfowl populations were at all-time lows in the early 1930s. Through our work and works of other conservation organizations, we've been able to stabilize wetlands across the prairie region, the most important region for waterfowl breeding, and met that mission. But in the 85 years that we've worked, we've really started to focus on those other values and functions of wetlands, recognizing that hunter numbers are declining, but the value of wetlands to Canadians, and in fact continentally when it comes to migratory birds, are still intact and as important as ever. And that's despite the fact that across the country we've lost close to 70% of our wetland base. Fortunately, Canada has 25% of the world's wetlands, so we're wetland rich, but that loss has happened in very critical areas such as the prairies and southern Ontario, the settled areas of the country. I think we all realize as Canadians that most of our population in this country lies within 100 miles of the American border. So that's the area that's had the most intensive impact and tends to be the most productive area of the country in terms of soil quality, agricultural interests, and it's where people want to settle. So that's where we have our biggest interaction or negative interactions with wetlands. Of course, wetlands are very powerful natural resources. They provide water quality, flood and drought prevention, climate change solutions, sequester carbon, support biodiversity, and are great for recreation and learning, as I talked about the center that we have here at Okamic. People like to get out in wetlands and canoe and fish and hunt and do all kinds of things, pick berries. It's a very important feature for human recreation. And some urban areas are starting to realize that and incorporate wetlands in their subdivision development, naturalize what would have been created as stormwater ponds 25, 30 years ago, make those more natural features. So people are starting to realize the value of wetlands, but it's still a major sales point that we have to press as we continue to lose some 80 acres of wetlands a day across Canada. So our approach to conservation includes research, technology, and innovation. We have a science-based approach to conservation. It's led by an in-house team of world-class researchers group called the Institute for Wetlands and Waterfowl Research, whose findings are supported by the development of conservation tools and protocols. We contribute extensive to mapping of wetlands to identify where the critical wetlands are. We work with industry in mapping on forest licenses and so on, critical wetlands, and developing best management practices through a science-based approach to ensure that sustainable development is achieved with our critical partners, industry partners. We really strive for landscape level conservation. We believe that having that extensive impact on the landscape is important. Just isolated postage stamps of wetlands and associated habitats have limited value in supporting biodiversity and those other ecological goods and services I've mentioned. So we go through land purchase, outright land acquisition, conservation easements, and farm gate programs where we're working with producers on the prairies to change grazing practices, convert more cultivated land to forages to support the beef industry. Right now, the beef industry is getting a bit of a knock in terms of its negative contributions to climate change through methane, but I think that's misplaced. I think if you look at the impact that cattle ranching has on the landscape, the extensive grasslands that are supported by the cattle industry, it outweighs some of the costs of producing more plant-based foods when you have wall-to-wall cultivation and pesticide use. So there's that trade-off that has to be made on the landscape. We need vegetable protection, we need soybeans, we need canola, but our greatest partner in the ag sector historically has been the cattle industry. That's starting to switch now as the more plant-based folks are recognizing the importance of sustainable development and sustainable agriculture that includes natural features on the landscape. So again, getting that message out that these natural features are important because they support pollinators, they support water, things that plants need to grow is a critical message to send to those cultivation and agriculture, the row croppers, so that natural features persist within those highly cultivated landscapes. So again, trying to reach that balance is critical. Partnerships and collaboration are key to our success. I'll talk about the Canadian Wetlands Roundtable, but we cannot buy and own or conserve enough land through conservation easements alone. We recognize the importance of working landscape, whether it's the forest center, the sector, or the ag sector, oil and gas sectors. How do we work with these groups to achieve common goals and achieve that sustainable development on the landscape? Ducks Unlimited is not what you'd view as an advocacy group where we would try and stop development. We try and figure out with the developers how best to make that development compatible with the sustainable goals that we share. And obviously education, say advocacy is a different level. It's not chaining yourself to the last wetland or tree. It's advocating for that sustainable development is really where our advocacy lies. And we're at the table with federal, provincial, and municipal officials from every political stripe, share our expertise. We're apolitical, help inform policies that contribute to economic prosperity and environmental sustainability. Community engagement is important. We have wetlands and centers of excellence that are at the high school level where we teach high school students about the importance of wetlands and sustainable development. We're doing the same through some university partnerships, and we've backed away a little bit from elementary schools. We were there heavy in the past, but we feel as youth age, it's better to hit them at the high school level and try and work with them where they've got a broader understanding of the importance of wetlands and are starting to understand aspects of sustainable development. Our impact. Okay, so what have we done in 85 years? Well, we've got over 12,000 habitat projects across the country, 6.2 million acres conserved, including 3.1 million acres of those that we've actually done active habitat restoration on. And through policy initiatives and working with industrial sectors such as forestry, oil and gas, we've influenced best management practices or designation of another 228 million acres. So pretty significant impact over 85 years. But when you compare that to the total land base of Canada, we've got to do much more. We've got to do it in a partnered approach. We've had a continental reach. There's DU Canada in the 80s. Ducks Unlimited started 1980s. DU started in the US to deliver habitat programs. Prior to that, they were just a funding mechanism to send money north to Canada to the breeding grounds. But over the last 30 years, they've become very active across the US countryside, as well as DU Mexico, a much smaller organization, but targeted on critical mangrove habitats and other critical wetland features in Mexico. So we are continent-wide, 3 different sister organizations that work together in sharing science and conservation planning. Our solutions, conservation management, follow best practice in land management, conserve and restore priority landscape. These nature-based environmental solutions are really a focus now. 85 years of wetland and native grassland knowledge and research and restoration experience. We know the biodiversity value. We know the carbon value of our lands. We know the flood control value. We need to sell that value to others so they understand that conserving wetlands can actually improve them, not cost their bottom line. Climate resilience, as mentioned, from carbon capture and flood and drought mitigation, DU is advancing research and programs to improve our future. Wetlands are critical piece. Wetlands and grasslands are critical pieces in the fight of climate change. Industry solutions, again, whether it's agricultural industry, forestry, oil and gas, major impacts of major land holdings across the country that we need to be able to work with and advance common goals. I've already talked about education. You're ready to take action. We're working hand in hand with partners of all types to conserve, restore, and influence over 15 million acres of wetlands. And just by conveying the messages I'm trying to tell you today to your peers, you are taking actions or can take actions to advance knowledge of wetland conservation. We celebrate our 85th year. The needs of growing population take a toll on our natural spaces. We've lost over 70% of our wetland base in southern areas, and it's estimated 80 acres are lost every day. Compounding threats of biodiversity loss and climate change are further impacting our community's way of life as Canadians. We really need to focus on the future and get these messages out. So I'll switch gears now and talk briefly about the Canadian Wetland Roundtable. I think that was the initial hook for this group. So the Canadian Wetland Roundtable was a group that we started in 2014. 2013, we recognized, we being a group of wetland conservation partners under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan of the Canadian federal government, other NGOs, and Ducks Unlimited participated in the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. We have various committees. We recognize the need to revisit national leadership in wetland conservation. We held a workshop in 2014, wetland leadership workshop in Ottawa. Some 250 people participated. And as a result of that workshop, we formed the Wetland Roundtable. And we set a vision, mission, and strategic direction. We've hosted a number of workshops and produced a number of reports. Our executive committee had included Frank Kehoe from Canadian Federation of Agriculture. He's moved on to the, excuse me, to the fertilizer sector. So we're looking for another co-chair. Myself as co-chair with Frank, Cam Mack from a group called Wildlife Habitat Canada, and Jim Brennan, my colleague in our policy group in Ottawa with Ducks Unlimited. We have the Canadian Forest Products Association, Canadian Cattlemen's, Canadian Sphagnum and Peanut Moss Association, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CropLife Canada, BC Wildlife Federation, the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and a number of academics on the group. We've kept government as ex officio because what we see this group doing is really forming to the point where we can lobby government and do some advocacy, and that becomes very difficult for a government member on the group to advocate or lobby their own government department. So we've kept them on side, but separate from the actual membership of the group. Good news is we haven't lost any members in almost 10 years now. We're looking to grow the membership, and our external contact list from the workshops that we've held is over 250 individuals. So a fair amount of interest in this area of national wetland leadership. We've got a website, which you're welcome to have a look at if you haven't already. We've got the reports from our various workshops, the wetland leadership workshop that I mentioned that started the whole thing, a specific wetland policy workshop in 2016, wetland inventory workshop. One thing we are lacking in Canada is a comprehensive inventory of our wetland base across the country. That's something we're strongly advocating, because as you move into no net loss policies, it's pretty tough to achieve a no net loss policy if you don't understand how many wetlands you had in the first place. And there's some kind of controversy around no net loss. This ties back to our policy workshop. CAP, for example, wasn't a big supporter of the concept of no net loss. Certainly want to work, CAP certainly wants to work to conserve and restore wetlands on the areas they impact. But one of the challenges with no net loss, as I mentioned, is without that inventory, you really don't know what you're working back to. So no net loss is an interesting policy tenet that has been in place in the US for a lot longer than in Canada, and they're finding real challenges with that as a central tenet. However, it doesn't take away from the desire to have wetlands conserved through policy to achieve sustainable development goals, but it is problematic. So those are some of the things we're trying to advance in terms of dialogue. How do we get there from here and ensure that wetlands continue to be a valued resource on our landscape? We had a wetland ecological goods and services workshop in 2017, looking at current science and evaluation of the other economic values that come from wetlands. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And key recommendations and next steps in developing Canadian wetland inventory is ongoing right now. We're working with Environment Canada, and it looks like there'll be some funding to really expand the inventory over the next 5 years. Positioning the wetlands as nature-based climate solutions is something the group has been done and successfully. Environment and Climate Change Canada has provided $450,000 over 3 years. We're halfway into this now to advance 5 projects, advancing the wetland inventory, determining the economic value of wetlands to Canadians, wetland evaluation guide, and a wetland policy framework, as well as wetland BMPs. I'll talk about each one of these individually. Wetland inventory, I talked a bit about this, but working with ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada, to develop a joint strategy for wetland inventory with our industry partners at the table. We set this as a needs for Canada in 2017. We've validated the various needs and policy uses of wetlands. As I say, wetlands inventory, as I say, achieving those policy goals, you need that baseline inventory, but you also need ongoing monitoring to ensure that you're not losing wetlands faster than you're gaining or trying to conserve them. We've developed a tech team to design a series of workshops and define a schema, the GIS-based approach that we would take to inventorying wetlands. And that work is ongoing. We're going to share the ownership of that with our partners around the roundtable, but it'll be DU and ECCC leading the wetland inventory. Value of wetlands to Canadians. Last estimate was in 2003. It was estimated that wetlands through the ecological goods and services such as flood control, water quality, biodiversity provide about $20 billion a year to the Canadian economy. That number is fairly low. We had another study done just on the 6.4 million acres of wetlands that DU has under conservation, and the estimate was well over 100 billion just on that land base. So the true number obviously is a lot higher than 20 billion, but this number is critical when we're making economic arguments for wetland conservation, particularly in the face of other industrial pursuits, whether it be a farmer trying to drain a wetland to grow canola. What is that wetland really worth to society, and how do we provide appropriate offsetting to keep that wetland feature on the landscape as appropriate? So the estimate now, we need to refine it, but it's probably closer to 500 billion a year than 20 billion a year based on emerging science. And that doesn't even consider all the values and functions of wetlands. So that's something that I always thought one term that we wanted to use is really to advance Canada's wetland industry, wetland conservation industry, because until you take it into that industrial realm and really talking economics, it's pretty hollow just to argue that wetlands are important. We have to keep them. So that's a education factor, I think, that can resonate with people. Once you put an economic value on and provide appropriate economic incentives to keep those wetlands in place, it's important. And even in the face of wetland policies, when I worked in the province of New Brunswick years ago, I was responsible for various aspects of wetland conservation, including EIAs, economic impact assessments. The Trans-Canada Highway was going through a major wetland, successfully negotiated $1.8 million for mitigation of the impacts on 34 hectares. Sounds like a lot of money for a wetland conservationist. It generally works in poor economy, but when actually got through the EIA and realized that wouldn't even put the lights on the bridge across the river, you know, what we're arguing here is relatively small relative to other economic forces that we're dealing with. For example, Ducks Unlimited has a budget of 150 million a year and change. Well, put that in perspective, how many miles of 4-lane highway you might get across this country. You know, that might give you what, 10 miles, something like that. It's a relatively small amount of money that we're putting into conservation relative to the values of those wetlands to Canadians and relative to the other economics that are on the landscape that are competing with wetland space. So we gotta make arguments to bring a better balance there, I think. Rambling a little bit there, but my point is that understanding that economic value of wetlands to Canadians is critically important. Wetland evaluation guide, a tool that you can go out and apply that economic value to a particular wetland and come up with an estimate of the value of a particular wetland. That's a project that we're working on. Wetland policy framework, and this is really bringing the partners together, industry, NGOs, government, and looking at whether no net loss as a policy makes sense. What are the alternatives? What are the sorts of offsetting that we would want? You know, if you just have to destroy an acre of wetland here, you know, do we need to replace it with 1 or 3? What are the right offsets to keep that landscape sustainable and keep that wetland function in place on the landscape? And recognize, you know, there's places where we may lose wetlands, but can we offset that loss somewhere else in a responsible manner is really what we need to wrestle with in terms of a policy framework. So we're going to hold workshops this year to open that dialogue and try and gain consensus on the best approach to wetland conservation through policy. Try to minimize the friction once a policy is put in place by having people on site up front. Critical partnership approach. Then BMPs. Lots of industries have great best management practices to conserve wetlands and other natural features. Let's share that information across industries, and again put that economic component to underlie it, and advance sustainable development through supporting BMP application where there are impacts on the landscape. And I think my last slide. Take home. Wetlands are critical natural resources. To be sustainable, development must consider conservation of natural features. Economic valuation of natural features is a critical science need. As I say, developing that thought of these things as part of the industrial complex, not something that competes with the industrial complex, is where my head goes at. And partnerships and education, getting people to understand this, are key to success. That's all I've got. So happy to answer any questions or thoughts that you may have on what I've said. Critical, complimentary, whatever, fire away.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much.